So why don't you just put the end to the record in the argument and put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Seibel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. Why don't you talk to the administrator at NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight.
Mr. Seibel, you do not deserve answers.
If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
What you are about to see is an accurate and well-researched documentary about the origin of the space race, its tragic consequences, and finally, the reality of NASA's claim that they landed men on the moon in 1969. Let's begin. When people discuss the possibility that the Apollo moon missions were faked by NASA, a question that often arises is why would NASA fake the moon landings? Actually, there is a perfectly logical and historically plausible explanation to this question. 2 years after World War II, in 1947, a new Cold War began, as political and military tensions arose between the Americans and the Soviets. Much like today, the USA and the Soviet Union were regarded as the major world powers, with each recognizing the other as their primary and most dangerous enemy. Although major regional conflicts, known as proxy wars, continued around the world, supported by either East or West, the Cold War was essentially about bluff and counter-bluff between the two antagonists, with each using deception methods and fake propaganda to mislead the other into believing their technology and military might was by far the more advanced and superior. By the mid-50s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had started developing long-range missiles, the crucial objective being the development of weaponry capable of striking each other's countries. But there was another crucial objective emerging at that time, and that objective was to be the first to conquer and ultimately control outer space and the moon. On the 28th of January 1958, United States Air Force Brigadier General Homer A. Boshi, Deputy Director of Air Force Research and Development, warned, "He who controls the moon, controls the Earth."
Eleven, 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 0, all engine running. Liftoff, we have a liftoff, 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading.
October 4th, 1957, the day the Soviet Union shocked the USA and the entire civilized world by being the first country on Earth to send a satellite into space. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union claimed to have launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to reach low Earth orbit. This was a major blow to America, and in particular to the US government and military, who saw this apparently extraordinary achievement as an ominous and potentially hostile threat to their national security.
The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
Ever since the news of Sputnik flashed around the world, America has been asking questions. What went wrong? How did a nation of backward peasants forge so dramatically ahead of us in the race to space?
Senator Jackson of Washington describes the Russian achievement as a devastating blow to the prestige of the United States.
The people of the United States have been humiliated, they're disturbed, and they're unhappy. The enemy of ours has outdistanced us.
Russia's getting into space really bothers me.
We are headed downhill to the status of a second-rate world power.
Not just our pride, but our security is at stake.
We surely don't want to become hysterical, but let's become factual. Let's start telling the truth. And let's face the fact that we've taken a licking, psychologically at least, and scientifically, and it has embarrassed us throughout the world.
If Russia wins dominance of this completely new area, well, I think the consequences are fairly plain. Probable Soviet world domination.
And so it was. On the 29th of July, 1958, in direct response to the Soviet Union's launch of its satellite, President Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, establishing America's publicly funded space agency, NASA. Over the next 4 years, the space race between the Soviets and the USA began hotting up, each determined to outdo the other and win the race to the moon. On the 31st of January, 1958, the U.S. finally entered the space race by launching Explorer 1, the first U.S. satellite to reach orbit. This was followed on the 18th of December, 1958, with the U.S. launch of SCORE, the world's first communications satellite. On the 2nd of January, 1959, the USSR launches Luna 1. On the 2nd of August, 1959, the U.S. launches Explorer 6, the world's first weather satellite. On the 12th of September 1959, the USSR launches Luna 2 and accomplishes its mission of creating the first spacecraft to reach the surface of the moon. And on the 4th of October 1959, they launched Luna 3 and succeeds in their mission of sending an object into orbit around the moon. On the 19th of August 1960, aboard the Soviet Union's Sputnik 5, the first animals, 2 dogs, Belka and Strelka, and a range of plants are returned alive from space. And finally, on the 31st of January 1961, Ham, a U.S. chimpanzee, becomes the first hominid or great ape in space, and the first to successfully survive the landing. A mere 10 weeks after Ham's trip into space, the Soviets shocked America and the world again when they claimed to have launched the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into low Earth orbit on April 12, 1961. And the dire implications of this extraordinary feat swiftly became depressingly clear. It was now pretty plain to the U.S. government and the American people that NASA's science and space technology was seriously lagging behind the feared Soviet foe. This greatly troubled the young and popular, newly elected U.S. President John F. Kennedy. He fully understood that they had to somehow emphatically prove, not just to the Russians, but to the entire world, that they were the most superior, most technologically advanced nation on the planet. With Gagarin, the Soviets had clearly made the first strike. Now NASA had to go a stage further. They had to be the first to land a man, an American, on the moon, and return him safely to the Earth.
But as NASA were soon to discover, launching a rocket into space, and then 250,000 miles to the moon, was not going to be easy. Despite these early failures, NASA persevered, which led to the beginning of Project Mercury.
On the morning of May 5th, 1961, the primary goal of Project Mercury came sharply into focus. 3 successful unmanned flights had proved that the Redstone launch vehicle and spacecraft were ready for manned application. Today, the ballistic mission would be flown once again, but this one, Mercury Redstone number 3, would be different. For Navy Commander Alan B. Shepard, the countdown had begun months earlier. From the day he was selected to be the first American to attempt suborbital space flight, he had undergone 40 separate simulated flights. 3 days ago, he had stood as he stood now when the flight was scrubbed for weather. But today, May 5th, the weather was go. The launch vehicle and the spacecraft, named Freedom 7, were go. The launch pad crews and downrange recovery forces were go.
15, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Lift off.
All right, lift off and the clock has started.
Okay, you're on your way.
Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
I send you.
This is Freedom 7. The fuel is go, 1.2 G. Cabin at 14 psi. Oxygen is go.
As the launch and flight of Freedom 7 were monitored by Mercury Control, it became apparent that all systems were functioning perfectly. At 5 minutes and 14 seconds after launch, at a peak altitude of 116 statute miles, the retro rockets fired, and astronaut Shepard in Mercury spacecraft Freedom 7 began his long plunge back to Earth. Astronaut Alan Shepard, the first American to achieve spaceflight.
Impressed by NASA's Mercury manned flight achievement, Kennedy sent Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, in his role as chairman of the National Aeronautics and Space Council, to discuss this with NASA and ascertain if landing a man on the moon was not only feasible, but achievable by the end of the decade, and what the cost of such a project would be. Johnson had discussions with NASA Administrator James Webb, who believed it would require $22 billion to achieve a moon landing by the end of the decade. He also had discussions with Wernher von Braun, the recently appointed director of NASA's new George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. Webb and von Braun assured Johnson they were fairly confident that with the right funding, a moon landing could be achievable by the end of the decade. Armed with this information, President Kennedy gave a speech to Congress on May 25, 1961, just 20 days after Alan Shepard's historic flight.
The dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Kennedy's words to Congress clearly succeeded in capturing the American people's hearts, minds, and imagination. The fears of the Soviets reaching the moon first were forgotten. As another Mercury flight was launched on the 21st of July 1961, carrying astronaut Virgil Gus Grissom, they now had an unshakable belief that America had surpassed the Soviets and that the first human on the moon would almost certainly be an American.
A Mercury spacecraft was once again prepared for flight. This one was slightly different, having an observation window for attitude reference and recognition of ground checkpoints. Another new feature was the explosive-operated exit hatch. The astronauts selected for the Mercury Redstone No. 4 mission, Air Force Captain Virgil Grissom, entered the spacecraft at 3:58 a.m. on the morning of July 21st, 1961. 3 hours and 22 minutes later, MR4 was launched. Primary flight objectives were, as before, familiarize man with a brief but complete space flight experience, including the liftoff, powered, weightless, and landing phases of the flight. In addition, effectiveness of the spacecraft window was to be determined, and the explosively actuated hatch was to be flown for the first time in a manned spacecraft. Shortly after Liberty Bell 7 reached the water, the hatch blew prematurely. Astronaut Grissom escaped unhurt from the sinking spacecraft. However, the extra weight of water proved too much for the recovery helicopter to lift, and Liberty Bell 7 was lost. Despite this loss, the flight of MR4 was a success, having achieved all of its primary objectives. 2 manned suborbital missions had been accomplished.
Following on from the successes of astronauts Alan Shepard and Virgil Gus Grissom, John Glenn became the third Mercury astronaut, and the first American to orbit the Earth on Mercury Atlas 6, on February 20, 1962.
It was now time to break it to the world and the Soviets, but more importantly to the people of America, that the USA had chosen to send a man to the moon.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. We shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first, before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
Brutally assassinated in 1963, President Jack Kennedy was destined not to witness the fulfillment of his dream. That of the USA being the first to land a man, an American man, on the surface of the moon, returning him safely to the Earth before the end of the decade in 1969. As the world joined with America to grieve and collectively mourn his loss, NASA knew they now had little choice but to give the American people what they so desperately wanted. One way or another, they had to achieve Kennedy's seemingly impossible dream of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade to ensure his enduring legacy for the people and for the protection of their nation. Failure would now not be an option.
After the comparative success of the Mercury and Gemini projects, including a spacewalk by astronaut Ed White in 1965, the first manned mission of the Apollo program, Apollo 1, was planned to be a low Earth orbital test of the Command and Service Module. Scheduled to launch on February 21, 1967, Apollo 1 was to demonstrate performance, launch operations and control facilities of the Apollo and Saturn V launch vehicle.
Warning. The following segment contains harrowing scenes and sounds that are not suitable for children or those of a nervous disposition. Viewer discretion is therefore strongly advised.
In 1967, 2 years before Kennedy's end-of-decade Moonshot deadline, NASA suffered a tragic and momentous setback when during a launch rehearsal test of Apollo 1 at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station, a cabin fire broke out and destroyed the command module, killing all 3 astronauts, Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee.
How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings? They can't hear a thing you're saying. Jesus Christ. Say again? I said, how are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings? You tell them, Gus. You tell them. Now, shit. I got a surge in the AC bus 2 voltage. Carver setting the meter. You getting this, Gus?
Raj, you picking anything up on the dials?
This is a CBS News special report.
This is Mike Wallace at the CBS Newsroom in New York. America's first 3 Apollo astronauts were trapped and killed by a flash fire that swept their moonship early tonight during a launch pad test at Cape Kennedy in Florida. Virgil Gus Grissom, 40 years old, one of the original Mercury astronauts, the first American astronaut to go twice into space. Edward White, 36 years old, the first American to walk in space. And rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, training for his first space flight, Apollo 1, scheduled for February 21st. These 3 astronauts were aboard their spaceship 10 minutes from a simulated liftoff at Cape Kennedy when the fire hit at about 6:30 tonight. They were inside their spaceship, pressurized, buttoned up inside their spacesuits when the fire hit. A closed-circuit television camera was relaying pictures of the astronauts lying on their backs inside the spacecraft atop the 2-stage Saturn I. There was a flash, and that was it, according to a NASA spokesman watching the television screen in the blockhouse a few hundred yards away from Launch Pad 34. The screen went blank, and he said there was no communication from the astronauts. They died silently and apparently swiftly.
As Gus Grissom and Ed White were laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery, and Roger Chaffee in his beloved West Point, the sorrow and the tears of a broken-hearted nation flowed freely, as America, and indeed the world, including the Soviets, mourned their tragic loss. A traumatized and heartbroken nation tearfully watched the televised funerals of Grissom, White and Chaffee in woeful disbelief. For these brave astronauts died, not in space, nor on the surface of the moon, but on their home planet, trapped inside a defective command module that was not fit for purpose. It was an horrific tragedy just so hard to take. It caused many Americans to turn against NASA, questioning if their fanatical race to the moon was really worth the loss of human lives. Once the funerals of Grissom, Chaffee and White were concluded, the recriminations began, and both NASA and North American Aviation, who designed and constructed the Apollo 1 Command Service Module, were pilloried by the press and a devastated American public alike. NASA's public image was now in tatters. Fearful of another tragedy, the Apollo program was put on hold whilst the command module's problems were investigated and dealt with. NASA and North American Aviation were harshly criticized for their negligence, deficiencies in design, manufacture, installation and quality control, as well as management and testing failures. Incredibly, within months of a tragic event that should have completely crushed Kennedy's dream of landing a man on the moon, due in large part to the support of President Lyndon B. Johnson, the Apollo program was back on track. NASA had miraculously survived, and even more miraculously, on November 9, 1967, had successfully launched the first unmanned test flight of the Apollo 4 Command Service Module, and the Saturn V launch vehicle.
The tower has been cleared. The tower has been cleared.
Oh, it's terrific. The floor is shaking. The thick glass window is shaking. Now we're holding it with our hands.
This was followed by Apollo 5, the first unmanned test flight of the lunar module in Earth orbit, launched on January 22, 1968 by the Saturn 1B that would have been used for Apollo 1.
Go for launch. Roger, we are go for launch. Okay, all flight controllers, let's play it cool. Launch sequence start. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, mission detected. Transmitted 5 enter. Clock start, 5 enter. Thrust okay. Affirmative. Program 11. Okay, TLK P11. Roll pitch start. Roll and pitch.
Apollo 6 was launched on April 4, 1968, the third and final unmanned flight in the Apollo program, and the second test of the Saturn V launch vehicle.
13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2,
1. Apollo 7 was launched on October 11, 1968, and was manned by Walter Schirra, Don Eisel and Walter Cunningham. It was to be an 11-day Earth orbital flight which was designed to test the command and service module systems. Apollo 8 was launched on December 21, 1968. It was the first manned spacecraft, crewed by Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, to leave Earth and travel to the Moon, orbiting 10 times without landing, and then returning to Earth. Apollo 9 was launched on March 3, 1969. During a 10-day mission, James McDivitt, David Scott, and Rusty Schweickart carried out a full test of the lunar landing mission in Earth orbit, performed the first crewed flight of a lunar module, the first docking and extraction of the same, one two-person spacewalk and the second docking of a two-crewed spacecraft.
In the second stage now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. The vehicle now completely pressurized. The vents closed. We are go. 30 seconds and counting. T-minus 25 seconds and counting. All aspects still go at this time as the computer monitors. 20 seconds.
Pilots go. GBM. GBM go.
Guidance released. 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Manned by astronauts John Young, Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan, Apollo 10 was launched on May 18, 1969, and was the fourth human spaceflight in the Apollo program, and the second to orbit the Moon. NASA, the mission's operator, described it as a dress rehearsal for the first Moon landing.
Engines running. Launch commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff 39 minutes past the hour. Stafford reports the clock has started. The tower is clear.
No one can possibly deny that NASA actually built, launched and flew rockets in Earth's atmosphere. But what also cannot be denied is that there is clearly a fundamental scientific problem regarding NASA's claims that their rockets can be launched and flown in the vacuum of space, which must be addressed. NASA's rocket scientists and aerospace engineers, and in particular, Wernher von Braun, must have been fully aware of the physics of flight and its four major principles: lift, thrust, drag, and weight. Consequently, they, and logically NASA, would have been fully cognizant of the fact that nothing on this planet, be it biological or mechanical, including rockets, could fly in an environment that had zero atmospheric pressure with which to create lift and thrust. So, NASA must surely have known that although launching a rocket into suborbital space was achievable, getting that rocket to fly and maneuver in a vast airless vacuum, and journey to the Moon and back, would be akin to herding cats. It just can't be done. The question is, how could NASA convince the Soviets, the American people, and the entire world that they had successfully sent a rocket through space, and landed a man on the surface of the Moon, if they didn't actually go? This is how they did it. These three men did not travel to the Moon in Apollo 11. They never even entered the command module of the spacecraft. The gigantic Saturn V rocket lifted off, minus their three passengers, who remained on terra firma, safe and sound. Apollo 11 never flew in space or traveled to the moon, which it was never designed to do. Like all the previous Apollo missions, it was designed to be just an expensive, but disposable, unmanned film prop that was never meant to leave Earth and fly in space. In full view of the cameras, Apollo 11 climbed skywards, before arcing and heading downrange in the direction of the Atlantic Ocean. Apollo 11 was meant to disappear out of sight of cameras and prying eyes, before being destroyed and dropped into the deepest part of the vast ocean. But something clearly went wrong, and the premature death of Apollo 11 was unintentionally filmed, as the command module unexpectedly appeared, and fell from the heavens, completely engulfed in a mass of flames. Truth is, if these 3 astronauts had really been sitting inside their fiery command module, they would have suffered the same fate as Grissom, White and Chaffee, and would never have made it to their press conference.
So why don't you just put the end to the record in the argument and put your hand on the Bible, swear to God you walked on the moon.
Mr. Seibel, knowing you, that's probably a fake Bible.
Well, you're talking to the wrong guy. Why don't you talk to the administrator at NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight.
Mr. Seibel, you do not deserve answers.
If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
Still believe these 3 men landed on the moon?
If you would like to be kept informed of future uploads of this series, please like, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Many thanks for your support. It is very much appreciated.